Good day, our topic is about the continuing past, Chapter 1. Philippines was a country securely incorporated into the American colonial framework. Because of the American occupation, it had shaped the Philippine society in the American image. At dito din nagmula yung colonial mentality na meron ng mga Filipinos.
Collaborationist tendencies, the Americans dissolving the unity of national identity, and revolutionary consciousness by the means of massive campaign of acculturation, by the process of miseducation, and by the implantation of American political institutions and customs in the evolving colonial society. So here in collaboration tendencies, the revolutionary forces began to suffer reverses because of this, and the elite anxious to protect their own economic position are adopted by a capitulationist and collaborative attitude toward the new colonizers. While the American was still in progress, many Ilustrados quickly went over to the side of Americans.
The anti-Spanish struggle was rooted in economic exploitation, the personal abuses committed by the Spaniards, and their blatant denial of basic political and civil rights. Dahil nga katatapos pa lamang ng revolution against Spanish colonialism, it had given the Filipino people insufficient experience to cope with the American imperialism.
So here in colonial politics, it says that the only way to achieve independence was through the road charted by the United States. Together with the English language, the public school system, and the fairly rapid Philippinization of the bureaucracy, colonial politics became a vehicle for the political education of the Filipino. Philippine politics became a colonial version of American wards politics and featured a perpetual scramble for position and patronage which the colonial power satisfied as a reward for its own political and economic objectives. Although these politicians continued to pay lip service to the goal of complete, immediate, and absolute independence and defense to the people's faithful adherence to their old dream. They were in effect largely instrumental in persuading their countrymen that the only way to achieve independence was through the road charted by the United States. So, pinapakita lang dito na nang wala ang Amerika, hindi natin makakamtan yung pagiging independent na kailangan natin umasa sa kanila. So, next is new level of awareness. The Sakdal movement of the mid-1930s labor unions in Manila under radical leadership and the peasant unions of Central Luzon, which came under the influence of both socialist movement of Pedro Abad Santos and the newly established Communist Party. So here in new level of awareness, ito yung naging mitsa or naging dahilan para mamulat tayo sa katotohanan na kaya nating mamuhay, manindigan sa sarili nating mga paa. Kumbaga sila yung naging dahilan para mamulat tayo na kaya natin magtrabaho, kaya natin kumita ng pera, kaya nating tumayo ng sarili nating ekonomiya. Because of them, nakatayo tayo noon ng mga ekonomiya na kailangan sa bansa natin at mga bagay na nagagawa dahil sa kanila. Sila yung nagtaas ng ating moral.
Miseducation, American-oriented media, and colonial politics were all factors that impeded a correct understanding of colonial reality. Through colonial education and media, the various forms of exploitation were presented as assistance, and the few voices that sought to expose the truth were drowned by the oratory of the advocates of independence within the framework of American protection and the dependence on the American market. Dahil nga we are under American occupation, kung ano yung gusto nilang ipalabas sa education and sa media ay maaari nilang kontrolin. Economy was completely tied up with and dependent on the United States. So, nanatili Yung agricultural economy, Filipino capital was predominantly in agriculture and in trade. American economic policies, particularly pre-trade, had developed an economy based on agricultural exports to the United States. The Filipinos saw the world events of 1930s through the American eyes and responded as an American colonial. In 1938 came Hitler's successive annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia, followed by his invasion of Poland in 1939, which led to British and French declaration of war on Germany. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. In Asia, Japan had been escalating her own war on China. She took advantage of the weakness of Vichy France to occupy Indochina. Mid-1941, the American government responded to these ominous moves by freezing Japanese assets and credits in the United States and instituting an embargo, particularly on oil. During the fascist aggressions, naniniwala yung Philippine government na it would be safer to remain under the wing of United States. Naniniwala sila in the faith in American power and confidence in her protection na nagbibigay ng false sense of security.
So next is United Front. December 1936 exerted great efforts to establish an anti-fascist United Front with various sectors of society. So here in United Front, the mass movement in the area had been steadily moving towards a confrontation with the land-owning classes, to some extent with the colonial power as well. Peasant and labor organizations were increasing the tempo of their struggle and gaining new strength. A measure of this strength in Pampanga, the radical center, may be gleaned from the elections of 1940. The United Front addressed itself to the task of fostering national unity in the face of imminent danger of Japanese invasion. It is an inescapable assumption of this unity was acceptance of continued American rule until the grant of independence in 1946, and this is premise would have far-reaching consequences.
The Philippines had a full-blown fascist movement in the Manila Phalange. Its active leaders, Father Silvestre Sancho, rector of the University of Santo Tomas, Andres Soriano, Enrique Sobel de Ayala, and Carmen Vida de Elizalde, who was the head of the women's section. Father Sancho arranged the University of Santo Tomas to honor fascist dictator Francisco Franco by naming him its rector magnificus. Having received special training from Phalange chiefs, these volunteers operated as Axis Fifth Column, disrupting its operations and spreading demoralizing rumors, particularly after the first Japanese air raids over Manila.
So next is Fifth Column. Here in Fifth Column, the Ganap was a new group which drew its membership from remnants of the old Sakdalistas, Benigno Ramos, the Lapyang Ganap, Tandis or principal chieftain. The Fifth Column has Sakdalista movement. It is quickly disintegrated and lost its influence among the masses of southern Luzon, and Benigno Ramos, whose pro-Japanese sentiments had been discernible even during Sakdal days, tried to lead the movement from his place of exile in Japan. He returned to the Philippines in 1939, but he was arrested but subsequently released on jail. He then set up a new political group, and it is the Lapyang Ganap, with himself as Tandis or principal chieftain. The Ganap was a fascist group which played a role in softening a process in preparation for the invasion. During the Japanese occupation, the Ganaps were part of the hardcore of Filipino collaborators.
Japanese economic penetration began as purely private venture, but the footholds Japanese businessmen acquired were later used as bases for official propaganda initiatives towards intelligence gathering operation. The Japanese established 100 of trade networks all over the country. Alarmed by these developments, the Philippine government passed an anti-dummy law on October 30, 1936, and in 1940, the Philippine immigration law that limited Japanese entry to 500 a year.
Japanese propaganda. Builders of Davao. Davao Nichi, land of cherry blossoms. General Artemio Ricarte, Pio Duran, wrote a book critical of American imperialism. So here in Japanese propaganda, in 1941, Japanese corporation even financed a newspaper of their own, and it is the Davao Nichi Association, the of Manila, Japanese Association of Manila, the Asia Club, and many others. They publish various magazines and sponsor a radio program called Land of Cherry Blossoms. And their periodicals also featured tirades on US imperialism and American racism. For this purpose, they encouraged General Artemio Ricarte, then living in exile in Yokohama, to write books and pamphlets on the Philippine Revolution and on how the Americans persecuted him for refusing to take an oath of allegiance of the United States. Another pro-Japanese, Pio Duran, wrote a book critical of American imperialism, and it was printed in Tokyo. So next is the real picture.
MacArthur became for most Filipinos a symbol of hope. He was a young lieutenant when his father, General Arthur MacArthur, was the commanding general of the U.S. Armed Forces in the Philippines. As Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur insisted that the Tidings-McDuffie Act provide for the continued presence of American military forces and stations in the Philippines during the Commonwealth period. Before the spark of war, MacArthur's defense plan called for a large reserve force of citizen soldiers to supplement a small professional army. However, the U.S. War Department was certain that MacArthur's plan, or any defense plan for that matter, would be ineffective against Japan, not only because of the impossibility of stationing sufficient forces in each of the major islands, but also because the Philippines had no munitions industry and no navy.
MacArthur's program was only giving the country a false illusion of security, because the defense preparation were beset by many difficulties. Among them, the problems posed by the illiteracy and ignorance of many Chinese, the variety of dialects which hindered communication, the serious lack of everything from funds to officers to weapons and even such rudimentary supplies as shoes and tents. And the training was very inefficient. Morale was low. Discipline is poor. These problems were at least partly due to inadequate food and large discrepancy in between Filipinos and Americans.
Quezon began casting about for alternative means of protecting the country. In June 1938, he made a secret trip to Japan, during which he allegedly attempted to secure a guarantee that Japan would respect the neutrality of an independent Philippines. Defense of the country was principally the responsibility of the United States. The Japanese invasion rudely shattered the Filipinos' safe colonial world.